Hello my dear friends, how is it going? I hope I find you all in good health and safe and sound. I'm Mario Theriger, and today I would like to briefly express something I'm sure you are aware of if you have been perhaps studying ancient paganisms and perhaps the spectrum of animism as well. But nevertheless, I find it curious, and it's a shame that in modern attempts to reconstruct paganism or in neo-paganism itself, many people seem to forget the reality of folk pagan beliefs or pagan folk beliefs, that despite people having lived in societies controlled by a specific organism which usually held the religious ceremonies, the common folk, let's say, in their private lives, in their domestic environments, in their daily lives outside the settings and contexts dominated by the elites, which in turn controlled religion, despite all of this, people seldom had a great focus on the divine, sometimes not at all, and instead focused much more on certain pragmatic behaviors with the aim to facilitate their lives and to avoid or mitigate as much harm and damage as possible in their lives, trying to achieve a set of circumstances that help them to have better lives with abundance, fertility, protection, good health, and tried to be more inserted in their surroundings in an attempt to not only better understand them, the surroundings, but also to be part of them in a way that didn't cause a lot of trouble to themselves and other entities living within the natural environment and the domestic environment as well. A series of actions that rarely involved the divine, the gods, but rather was towards the very entities with whom people shared space with in order to survive and make their world a little bit more habitable and more benign, more favorable. Well, this is a rather short video. I'm not here today to speak too much about anything, just a few thoughts to reflect upon, because today my head is a little bit fuzzy. Sometimes it happens. It happens more often than not. So just a few thoughts, nothing too fancy. As such, bear it with me if you would be so kind. Let me articulate this in the best way possible until I get to the point. Well then, where to begin? In our modern Western societies, in the past 100 years or so, in our attempts to bring back the pagan and animistic indigenous beliefs, we have certainly noticed that most of these new religious and spiritual currents often focus a lot on the gods. And although there are certainly many reasons for that, it seems to me that there are two main reasons for this continuation on a great focus towards the divine. The great majority of literary sources concerning pre-Christian religions were either recorded by the smallest percentage of pagans that either belonged to restrict groups with prominent social status and in their societies, let's say the elites being in positions of political power, often regulating, supervising the religious sphere. As such, it's mostly their testimonies we get to read from the perspective of a small percentage of pagans in positions of great privilege. And the stories of the gods often reflect the lives of the nobility to better provide an understanding to the general population that the privileged were or had the right to be in the positions they were and held such power because the entirety of their condition reflected the divine itself. So we end up getting an understanding of the divine according to powerful social groups, which were the minority. Or we get to know some of the gods and some other systems of religious beliefs through pagans who have had contact with other pagans and speak of them, but often from a position of self-perceptive superiority. And as such, they only speak of other pagans either through their own judgment or by hearsaying, or testimonies concerning pagans composed by Christians or Muslims in the Middle Ages, not in an attempt to safeguard the histories and beliefs of the past, but rather as forms of criticizing or to elaborate on similarities of beliefs to better convert the pagans by creating an appealing version of comparisons, or indeed written sources to denigrate pagans and expose the power of the new religions that were progressively overshadowing the previous beliefs. Well, as my channel is mostly about Scandinavian studies, a good example are the medieval Icelandic literary sources concerning pagans and pre-Christian Nordic beliefs, which certainly, there are still many pagan understandings we can try to filter out from those medieval sources, but it's not just a problem concerning the fact that such sources were written by Christians in a Christian society, but the fact that Icelanders of the Middle Ages that wrote these accounts concerning pre-Christian beliefs of Scandinavia, the only contact they have had with pagans was by reading and compiling the stories of past Christian saints that wrote about their interactions and experiences with the pagans. So we do get a lot of content concerning the gods, often either from the perspective of the smallest percentage of pagans which had a privileged position of power in which the divine served as a tool of religious and political control, or we have a lot of literary sources concerning the old gods through the lens of Abrahamic religious systems that used the old gods as devices to convey their own religious and mythological ideas to facilitate in the process of conversion. The other reason is precisely because the great majority of us and our ancestors for the past 1,500 years or so, give or take, of course depending on the country we live in and the stages of the processes of religious transitions, we have lived in societies that have greatly been shaped for this amount of time by Abrahamic religious systems of belief, in which there is indeed a great focus on the divine and little else. And we continue to live in societies in which religion has played a fundamental role in the shaping of the collective mentality of the masses in order to control them. So the tendency is this, to focus on the divine, the gods. We have little concrete about the religions or the belief systems of the people, the folk pagan beliefs, the belief systems of the common folk, of the majority of the population. Unless we turn to archaeology, of course, which helps us to understand several other contexts outside the reality of the groups and organisms that control the religion. And because of all of these factors previously mentioned, it is understandable why the great majority of neo-paganisms focus on the divine, because that's the tendency, either by accommodation, or because it is customary, or because of acceptance that has become commonplace, or because most of the surviving sources do have a great focus on the gods, but often because such sources were written by those whose actions to maintain power was in great part through the usage of the stories and mythologies and religions built around the divine to affirm their position and control the masses. One good example of this is legalism in ancient Greek culture. I've spoken about this on a very recent video, actually. You see, by all accounts, the ancient Greeks were pagan. But being pagan doesn't mean all of the population stood on the same grounds. Not at all. In fact, it is quite clear that the states of ancient Greece not only were quite different from one another in many aspects, but the Hellenic society was very hierarchical, and the smallest percentage of the population, to this day all over the world actually, was the elite, which controlled everything else. On that video, I've spoken about the Oracle of Delphi, a religious tool. Apollo is the messenger of Zeus and makes all things known through the Oracle. The Oracle, the Pythia, the priestess of the Temple of Apollo, made the god's desires, plans, intentions, policies be known to the mortals. We know that people would have to pay something, some form of payment through offer or the offering of something to the temple to speak with the god himself. We know the answers were carefully chosen to the questions asked. We know there was much deception in the answers according to which people, state, country or nation the priests at Delphi favored or not. We clearly see the cult of Apollo and the Delphic sanctuary as a political tool of control, which gained extraordinary proportions, and people really had the necessity of belief towards all of this and conducted their lives according to this system. We are talking about pagans that had a system of religious control very similar to that of later religions such as Christianity, in which you have to pay something to go to the church and speak with the god or hear what the priest has to say, which is a figure that speaks for the god or the divine. You attend the ceremonies held by the church and its members. You hear the words. Same thing with Islam, same thing with Judaism, same thing many pagan societies also did. Religion as a political and social tool of control through propaganda, fear, inspiration, fanaticism, promises, hopes, etc. The people may follow the religions of the state either for fear, for convenience, by force or by acceptance, and because it has or will eventually become deeply rooted in the system and is part or becomes part of culture. But the great majority of pagans of the past, even of Christians, that do not belong to these elites and have their own affairs and trying to survive in this world, have different attitudes towards religion back home in their private environment. Just as for the Christians in their private lives and, and daily affairs and within the familiar and domestic environment, saints have played and still play a bigger role than God. The majority of pagans, the common folk, also had these similar sentiments, to rely much more on entities that were part of their familiar reality and with whom they could create a far more intimate and personified and beneficial relationship with in order to make life more livable. Pragmatic behaviors to improve everyday living. Because the life, work and struggles of the common folk was never the same of that of the elites or of the people in prominent and privileged positions. The great majority of post-agrarian societies has always been clearly divided into specific groups, which we could somewhat divide into perhaps 3 groups, and it always looks like a pyramid. The smallest percentage, the top of the pyramid, which are those who rule, often in the same level of those who control the religions, because of course there may have been a time in early societies in which the figure in power held both the control of religion and the socio-economic and military power, but pretty much remained the same with the seemingly detachment of the figure in power, chieftain, king, emperor, from the religious sphere controlled by magicians, elders, priests. Religion and state have always walked hand in hand, either in the same figure of power or in practice, 2 independent organisms but always intertwined. The other part of the pyramid, at the middle, let's say, are the warriors, the military, which is never truly independent from the control of the elite on the top and are always a means to an end to whatever the state and the religious sphere wants. But even so, it's somewhat a different group due to its standardized occupation and enjoys several privileges that the other final group does not. The third group, the largest, the base of the pyramid that holds everything together, are the providers, the people who produce, whether it is production of food, exploitation of resources, craftsmanship, providing services, and so on and so forth. These are the great percentage of people often explored, exploited, and controlled by those in power, and whose lives do not often enjoy the privileges and commodities of the other groups on top. As such, the reality of the common folk, of the providers, is much different, and they have to rely on other aspects of the spiritual that are far more applicable, fitting, relevant, even useful to the reality they live in. So this is when pagan folk beliefs comes in. We can notice pretty distinct motivations and behaviors between these beliefs of the common folk, or these folk beliefs, and those of the state. Certainly, without a doubt, throughout history, in several pagan societies, the people would attend a ceremony held by the nobility, would participate, observe, or somewhat take part on the great festivals, public festivities, celebrations, and such. And truth be told, most of these held to the public also had as an objective to entertain the masses, to keep people happy and distracted, to avoid turning against their overlords. But surely people also had contact with the religions of the state, and certain elements were inevitably incorporated in their own spiritual affairs. However, the magical religious behaviors of the general public were much more turned to their own reality of survival and production. So their pagan folk beliefs were much more predisposed to a conduct that aimed to acquire beneficial aspects for the daily affairs, their daily affairs. It was a wide spectrum of activity, most of which was purely practical. There was none of that preoccupation with building a ladder to some divine entity, no particular need or worry to establish a contact with the gods in a way that aims to ascend to their realm eventually. The magical religious pragmatic behaviors of the common folk was much more designed to produce definite results in their daily affairs. For instance, you produce food in order to have sustenance, but also you are producing for the community, for the lord, for nobility, for the controlling organism. You need things to go right. So there were methods to ensure fertility of the soils. Or you had cattle and protection charms to make sure cattle doesn't get sick or stolen. A carving of a symbol on a chicken coop to make sure the chickens are protected at night from predators. The pouring out of libations towards landspirits, a sacrifice to ensure peace and plenty. Pouring out milk on the fields to ensure the fertility of the soils. Giving part of the food to ancestral spirits or entities. Maintaining the household entities happy by building an environment suitable for them, lest they get angry and things start to go bad within the house and with the family. Creating these relationships with all sorts of spirits, entities of land and house, elves, fairies, human ancestors, animal ancestors, etc. You see, it wasn't as straightforward as the religions of the state, which aimed to keep the gods happy, as well as following the commandments of the divine. Pagan folk magic and beliefs covered an amazing range of subjects and possibilities, much more in line with one's daily affairs. One particular family member went away for war or to trade and sell at the fair or the market or out on a fishing boat. So some form of magic was made to ensure their safety and safe return. For instance, knot magic, a string with knots that hold magical power that influences the weather and the winds. You unknot one and influences the particular wind you need on a given situation when out at sea. You make an amulet, some charm for protection. You chant, you sing and cast the bones and stones and whatnot for divination, or to find missing objects, or to communicate and find someone from afar. Protection against the evil eye with charms, gestures, prayers, all the above. Cursing, hexing, protection against others that send harmful magic, in turn sending it back. Sometimes jealousy gets in the way and that neighbor has a strong and young horse that helps to plow the fields. As such, that person has more and better production. So people tried to curse the animals, bind them with magic, call them out, send them away, or entice them so they could have them. And the owner of the horse, in turn, had to make some form of protective charm or sending out a familiar or a spirit emissary to counter the attempts to hex. Necromancy, augury, offerings at crossroads, offerings and libations at particular stones, trees, bodies of water, weather and elemental magic, second sight, herbalism, healing and poisons, death magic, sexual magic, battle magic, oral tradition of old ways passing on to the next generation, and so on and so forth. You get the point. Gods really rarely played a major role in the pagan folk beliefs, but they could indeed be called upon as well, obviously. However, most of the time it would seem that to have the blessings of a particular deity, it wasn't a direct behavior towards the deity itself, but through some sort of conduit or some object or animal representative of the deity. In most cases, always an intermediary element. You give a particular type of food or part of the crops to keep a specific animal or land spirit happy because it is the animal representative of some deity. You build a straw figure as a conduit of fertility and abundance magic, which can be kept or sacrificed through burning at specific auspicious moments. You wear a pendant, a charm, a talisman, an amulet that contains figurations, inscriptions, symbols, and other elements for a particular purpose and evoking some power that you need. It could even be to draw luck to your side. You get the point again, right? Pagan folk magic being quite animistic, pagan folk magic and beliefs being quite animistic, there's a wonderful variety of objects that demonstrate behaviors towards intentions, creating a very rich and unique material culture that distances itself from the religions and beliefs and belief systems of the state, right? Another point, perhaps it should stay for some other video, some other time, of course, but very briefly, just to leave something to think about, the anthropomorphization of the gods. Who were the first ones to give human appearance to the divine? Those who controlled religion, progressively giving a human appearance to the deities, but not just any human appearance, but rather that of themselves, of the very people who controlled the religiosity of society, those empowered by the religious beliefs of the state, those of and were the state themselves. The gods starting to look more human and wearing human clothes, objects, paraphernalia of all sorts. It wasn't the representative of the divine wearing the clothes, objects, utensils, signs and symbols of the gods, but rather the other way around. The gods progressively started to appear more like the humans who controlled the spiritual. And then we look at the belief systems of the masses, of the common folk, the providers, the entities whom these people were more focused on barely looked human. Surely, obviously, the gods of the elite were eventually also incorporated in the belief systems of the masses, if only by name, and by force or being controlled by the elite, or appreciation for what they saw and then adopted eventually, or simply as part of culture and witnessing and sometimes participating in the religious ceremonies, feasts, and festivals held by nobility when public displays. When it was a public display to the subjects. But the entities of the majority of the populations, the gods, spirits other than human and more than human persons, that they, with whom they created some form of relationship with for some beneficial outcome in their lives, most resembled animals, or were indeed animals, or hybrid beings or creatures, something between human and animal. Others were stylized figurations, others simply schematic forms or simple carvings on a surface, handcrafted materials that did not resemble anything concrete, and you can barely even attribute gender to them. Charms, talismans, stones, herbs, pieces of metal, a natural landscape feature, forces and elements of nature, words, prayers, symbols, signs, objects of all sorts, particular daily objects and utensils that gained a specific value and entered the spiritual behaviors within a household or a particular community, animal and or human body parts, all sorts of things that were much more in line with the daily life of the general populations. So, that's it. I'm not sure if you have enjoyed this video and if it was useful somehow and if I was able to truly pass on the message, so my apologies. What I know is that this turned out better than what I thought, because frankly today I'm not thinking much about anything. Just wanted to sort of leave something to think about, right? I've got to go to work again, so in this little pause I just wanted to keep you company and deliver something that I hope it may come to be useful. Something to think about, right? Although I understand the focus and sometimes even fanaticism, unfortunately, towards the divine from the part of many neo-pagan groups and neo-pagans themselves, I do think that it would be far more useful for all of us, pagans of this world and others, to be more animistic in our ways, in the sense of aspiring to build more beneficial relationships with the entities of our world in an attempt to make this world and life itself more habitable and more enjoyable. I do believe that being more inserted in our natural surroundings and to communicate with land and its persons, we eventually build respect towards land and its persons. As such, we mitigate the more destructive behaviors our human society has upon the land, building a more eco-friendly mentality which ultimately inspires us to fight for our future and for the life and existences of this world, because we begin to be more aware of the consequences our attitudes have upon land and its persons. Instead of objectifying nature and its living entities, we begin to be more empathic towards them because we become aware of the multi-diversity of beings, spaces and realms. And our place in this vast ecosystem becomes clearer, I think. In order to be properly inserted in it, I think we really must respect it and be aware of it and all its senses and realities. So, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, thank you for today. Until we meet again, my dear friends.